debate, and I think everyone's here for that debate. If we just a bit of time for members to get in their appropriate seats. We now move on to the next debate. Nick Herbert to move the motion.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Betts. I welcome this opportunity to raise the issue of rail services as they are provided for villagers in Hassocks, in my constituency, and indeed others who use this station, which is on the Brighton Main Line and which has Southern, Thameslink and Gatwick Express services. Mr. Betts, you might wonder why I am raising the issue of rail services to a village which, although it has a population of over 7,700 people, making it actually the largest settlement in my Arundel and South Downs constituency, is nevertheless the 10th busiest rail station in West Sussex and is used by many people who do not live in Hassocks itself. It is a commuter village. A large number of people move specifically to Hassocks because of the rail links which it provides to London and indeed to other places. And in fact, there are 1.3 million passengers a year who are using Hassocks Station. So my first and key point that I would be very grateful if the Minister would take on board, and I know he has because he very generously met me to discuss this issue before the introduction of the new timetable last month, is that this is not a small issue. There are a large number of people who are using the rail service from Hassocks in my constituency, and the Minister knows that they are very angry indeed. They have put up with 2 years of disruption because of the problems with the Southern service and because of the upgrade to London Bridge. They fully accept that the London Bridge upgrade is ultimately going to be to the benefit of passengers, but they are certainly not seeing it at the moment. And just as it looked as though we might be moving towards a steadier state for the rail services in West Sussex, which frankly over the last 2 years have been absolutely dismal, we now have serious disruption again. This all started with the introduction of the new timetable last month. And I would like to say straight away that I fully appreciate that there are more peak trains to Victoria being provided under the new timetable from Hassocks, and the same number to and from London Bridge, theoretically. And I will come to the actuality shortly. Theoretically, there are more such services. But, and this is the but, there are no longer any direct services to Clapham Junction, the busiest rail station in Europe, from Hassocks. So despite the size of the village, despite the numbers of people that are commuting from there, the direct services to Clapham Junction have simply been withdrawn. And I'm not talking about the disrupted timetable, I'm talking about the new timetable that was meant to offer this improved service to everyone in the country. And 4 peak time morning trains to Clapham Junction have been removed, and GTR admits that 3 of those journeys will now be slower by up to 10 minutes because of the need for my constituents to change services. 6 peak time return trains from Clapham Junction to Hassocks have been removed, and GTR admits that 4 of these will be slower by up to 10 minutes. GTR have told me that they appreciate that passengers will need to change trains, but the journey time will only increase by an average of 7 minutes. Well, commuters dispute this. They say that changes at Gatwick or East Croydon are rarely quick or easy because of overcrowding, and I note that GTR is giving figures based on a 4-minute change time at Gatwick. And I defy the Minister, GTR executives or anyone else to reliably be able to make a change at Gatwick at peak time, even if these trains were operating properly, based on only a 4-minute window. And a survey... I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend and for the work he's doing. I know many of us in West Sussex are working together on this. It's a huge problem across the county. On the particular point he's making about the changeover times, 4 minutes with crowded platforms, with mass disruption. I've got commuters who are very concerned about the safety elements of this. I'm sure that's something which is also a concern for his commuters as well.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend's intervention, and we have indeed been working together in West Sussex, and we have been working closely with my right honourable friend, the member for Mid Sussex, who is also very concerned about the disruption to services on the same line. We are all concerned about these unfeasible interchange times and indeed the safety implications, the implications for disabled passengers and so on. So it's no good producing figures that produce a theoretical benefit or not much of a change or not much of a problem for commuters because, of course, actually it's very disruptive to have to change when you had a direct service before. These are busy working people. They actually can't often get a seat once they've changed. Their working patterns are disrupted, and they're just very irritated by the claim that somehow the service is nearly as good as it was before. Well, it really isn't. And there is a mismatch between demand and train routes because Gatwick Express trains, which only stop at Victoria, are actually relatively empty, whereas Thameslink trains have been severely overcrowded. And an issue which I have raised with the Minister before is the question of whether actually it makes sense to have Gatwick Express trains that don't stop at the busiest station in Europe, Clapham Junction, thereby offering more choice to people who are flying to and from Gatwick. I think the demand that these trains run direct from Gatwick to Victoria is problematic anyway, but it's certainly disadvantaging my constituents at the moment. Now, I know that the Minister will tell me that only 9% of journeys from Hassocks are to, from or through Clapham Junction. So that sounds like very few. It's only affecting 9% of my commuting constituents. But actually that's 9% of a large number. And it's 9.45% to be precise, of nearly 595,000 journeys that are being made to London. And that means that there are over 56,000 single journeys a year from Hassocks in either direction to Clapham Junction that have now been withdrawn in terms of the direct service. So that is not a small impact. It is impacting upon my village, and people are very upset about it. Hassocks is a growing village. The number of houses is going to increase by a third in Hassocks alone, never mind in the surrounding area. And actually, to pick on the one of the stations that actually is one of the biggest ones in West Sussex, and to withdraw entirely the direct service to Clapham Junction simply doesn't make sense. And so I would be very grateful if I could repeat to the Minister my request that I made to him, to the Secretary of State, and to GTR and to Network Rail, insofar as it's a matter for them, which is, will they please reconsider this new timetable that has withdrawn this essential service for a large number of my constituents? Now, all of this would be one thing, and perhaps I wouldn't even be raising it, Mr. Betts, in this chamber, if it weren't for the fact that these are theoretical new services anyway. Because, frankly, the disruption that has resulted as a consequence of the new timetable has worsened the service, not just for these commuters who've had their service withdrawn, but for hundreds, no, thousands of others. And, frankly, the service since the introduction of the new timetable has been completely intolerable. And I said at the beginning of this debate that my constituents were angry about it. They really are angry. And this is happening on a daily basis. It was deeply ironic that before the introduction of the new timetable, GTR told me, we hope that with the introduction of this timetable, we will be in a position to provide a much more reliable service for all passengers travelling on our network. That would produce a very hollow laugh indeed from my constituents. And the Minister knows that there's been widespread withdrawal, cancellation and delay of services. And the important thing for the Minister to note is that this is not getting better. In fact, this is just as bad as it was when the new timetable was first introduced. So in the week before the timetable change, up to the 19th of May, there were 18 train cancellations. That was a normal, in inverted commas, service. Normal services in West Sussex appear to mean that my commuters have to accept that level of cancellations. Can you imagine if an airline were run on the same basis? But never mind, there were just 18 cancellations that week. In the first week of the new timetable, there were 245 trains cancelled, and I'm talking about trains to and from Hassocks. In the second week, there were 267. In the third week, there were 312, and in the fourth week, there were 290. So now we are in the fifth week, and we are still in a position where nearly 300 trains a week are being cancelled. Could we have expected that after 1 month of the new interim timetable, which is resulting in withdrawn services altogether, that there might be some improvement? Well, I'm afraid not. On Monday morning, I received an email from a despairing constituent, Mr. James Reed, who lives in Hurstpere Point, who said, "I feel I must write to express my dismay at the current situation, which appears to somehow deteriorate further every day. This morning, for example, I have never seen so many people waiting for a London train on the platforms at Hassocks. The 0623 was virtually full before it reached the village. Then there were additional stops at Haywards Heath and Three Bridges to compound matters. It is totally unacceptable for people to be standing on a train service at 6:30. And, Mr. Betts, I agree with that. And I have a very simple question for the Minister. When is this shambles going to come to an end? Because we are now 4 weeks on, and it continues to be appalling. I have here a timetable for rail services from Brighton and Hassocks in 1905, well over a century ago. And the fastest of 3 direct trains from Hassocks to London Bridge took just 1 hour, 17 minutes. And those were steam trains. So theoretically, we now have direct services from Hassocks to London Bridge that are 23 minutes faster. But the reality is we have a completely unreliable service. Mr. Betts, my constituents would be very grateful to be transported back to the days of 1905, where they had 3 reliable steam trains that took them to London every single morning, by comparison to the chaotic, shambolic, disrupted, withdrawn, cancelled services that they are facing now. The question is, what is going to be done about this? Well, there is the issue of redress. And I am grateful to GTR for at last recognising that tickets which are valid on one of the services should be passported to the others. I specifically asked for this. I'm very grateful that it's been introduced. But obviously, if you have a ticket for a southern service and that is cancelled, then you should be allowed to use it on a Thameslink or Gatwick Express service or whichever service is available. Then there is the issue of compensation. Of course, we must compensate passengers. But the compensation system is simply not good enough. It is not direct enough. It is not immediate enough. It is not sharp enough. It is too complicated for constituents to use. Actually, it just increases their irritation even more. We need some form of modern, sharper compensation system that is better than delay repay, which means that the rail operating companies feel real pain when actually they are providing a shambolic and shoddy service like this, and passengers are compensated on a much more immediate basis. And the reason we need that is not just because it's fair to customers, but also because it introduces greater accountability. And there is now the issue of who is going to be accountable for this shambles. We have seen the resignation of Charles Horton, the chief executive of GTR. But actually, what about Network Rail's responsibility for this matter, because they have admitted that they have some responsibility for the problems with Thameslink services because of their failure to deliver in the north, which meant that they didn't have enough staff to manage the new timetable. And GTR says that one of the reasons they were in such trouble is because they weren't given enough time to introduce the new timetable. There's a lot of the blame game being played. Well, who is being held accountable in Network Rail for this shambles? Yes, other projects may have been delivered on time. Yes, London Bridge may be wonderful. That's not the point. My constituents want to know that people are being held accountable for these problems so that they will not happen again. And these were unforced errors, frankly. This is not the same situation as we are seeing in the north with union disruption, or as we saw over the last 2 years with the disruption to southern services, which I think we all came to realise were largely driven by the unions, manipulating problems that already exist with the lack of track because of the London Bridge upgrade and with the shortage of drivers. There were other responsibilities, but the unions were driving it particularly. That is not the case with these Thameslink services now. We can't lay the blame at the door of the unions for this. It can be laid at the blame has to be laid at the managers, whether they are in Network Rail, whether they are in GTR, or whether they are in the Department of Transport, who frankly presided over this shambles. Why wasn't there an early warning system? Why wasn't there a risk register? Why weren't red lights flashing that this was a major change and could result in problems? We were still being told, right up to the introduction of the new timetable, there may be minor teething problems, but it'll be all right on the night. Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Betts, it has not been all right on the night, and we have to learn the lessons. And I know that there is going to be an inquiry into that. But frankly, I am being placed, as my honourable friends are, in the position where we are constantly having to apologise for the performance of the rail industry in our constituencies. And it is very difficult to explain to our constituents why more drastic action has not been taken to deal with this franchise. I'll give way to my
I'm
friend
most
again.
grateful to my honourable friend. He is absolutely right. He's making a speech of great passion. He's spot on every single point. As my right honourable friend knows, I have exactly the same issues being faced in Bolcombe. I've discussed this with the Minister before. A small village with a huge number of commuters who come into it. They pay a fortune every year in order to get to and from London, and the least thing they can expect is to be able to do so reliably. I like the tone of what my right honourable friend is saying. Would he agree with me that an inquiry is one thing? We simply need to know when these drivers are going to be trained and when the timetable will be working. There's two simple questions to which we need to have the answers as soon as they can be provided.
Again, I agree with my honourable friend. He's made the point very directly, and I'm sure the Minister will have heard it. We are going to have to look at the size of this franchise again. It is too big, frankly. A franchise that was meant to deliver benefits and economies of scale has only given us problems from the moment that it was introduced, and we need to look at the franchise holder as well. And I appreciate that that is a legal process, but my constituents cannot understand why GTR is still running this franchise. There are longer-term questions about the level of investment that's necessary in these lines, and West Sussex members will be very supportive of an increased level of investment, but that doesn't deal with the short-term issues. In conclusion, Mr. Betts, my constituents in Hassocks are paying in excess of £5,000 a year for their season tickets. They rely on these rail services, and I would therefore be very grateful if the Minister would first of all look again at the question of whether direct services to Clapham Junction from Hassocks can be restored, and secondly, if he can tell us when normal, reliable services are likely to be restored. I am very grateful to the Minister for his attention to these problems. I know how hard he has been working on them. His door has been open to us. He has been very receptive to the points that we have been making, and I certainly attach absolutely no blame to him or his colleagues. I think that he has been very badly let down indeed. So I am sorry to address the Minister in such tones, but it's important that I do so, because it's important for him to understand just how angry our constituents are now about this perpetually bad service and how despairing they are that there seems to be no end to it. They just want a normal, reliable rail service. In the 21st century, is that really too much to ask?
The question is, this House has considered rail services in Hassocks. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Betts, and I want to start by congratulating my right honourable friend, who, as we've just seen, is an extraordinarily powerful champion for his constituents. for securing this important debate on rail services in Hassocks. And I'd like, at the outset, to assure him that it is the department's #1 priority to ensure that his constituents and the constituents of my honourable friend, the member for Horsham, also get the rail services which they have every right to feel entitled to as soon as possible. He is under the impression that services have not been improving in recent days, and I'm disappointed to hear that, and I'm going to look into the statistics and the picture he painted of performance to and from Hassocks in recent days. Passengers travelling on those services should already have started to see improvement in their performance since GTR started cancelling services in advance rather than on the day. During the week beginning the 28th of May, some time ago now, there were several days with just 3 morning services from Hassocks to London Bridge. The other scheduled services were cancelled on the day, meaning that passengers could not plan ahead. Last week, by contrast, there were no on-the-day cancellations, and 5 services ran in each morning peak period. Now, I grant you, performance is still very far from being at the level he finds satisfactory, or we in the department find satisfactory. But I do hope that passengers who are seeing that kind of change do feel that there is improvement starting to happen. It must now accelerate, and that is the priority for the department. On the Hassocks to Victoria route, there are still too many delays, and I should add that in the morning peak last week, 12 services ran each day compared to the 7 scheduled services before the timetable changed. So even if there's much more room for improvement on the Victoria line, even there we are starting to see things move in the right direction. Mr. Betts, Network Rail and GTR are urgently developing and delivering plans to do more to reduce the disruption and to give passengers the greatest possible certainty of train services so they can better plan ahead. GTR, as I've mentioned, are removing services in advance from their timetable rather than on the day, and reducing weekend services to pre-May timetable levels. They are updating journey planners now on Fridays with the information on which services are being cancelled for the following week all loaded up there and then, so passengers can get a sense of what the travel patterns are going to be like for the coming week. This should bring about a more stable service than we've seen in recent weeks, and will be in place, going to his question, until a full replanning of driver resourcing can take place. GTR are also aiming to publish an amended timetable across the whole network. Once this is in place, the promised improvements of the May timetable will be introduced incrementally rather than as a big bang to avoid and reduce the risk of further disruption. Turning to questions about the future timetable once we're over this difficult period of disruptions following the implementation of the timetable. When it's fully implemented, the new timetable will deliver improvements to as many passengers as possible, while balancing the competing and often contradictory demands of different passenger groups. Peak time services from Hassocks, as the right honourable member, my right honourable friend, noted, no longer stop at Clapham Junction. This is because all peak services between Hassocks and Victoria are Gatwick Express trains coming from Brighton, which cannot stop between Gatwick Airport and Victoria. However, with a single change at Gatwick Airport, and we can look into his feeling that a 4-minute posited interchange was an unrealistic ambition. I'll certainly go back to Network Rail and GTR on that point to see whether that actually is a realistic interchange time. But if we assume for a moment that it's possible in that time, Hassocks passengers can make the journey to Clapham Junction with an average journey time that is roughly the same as before the timetable change, with some journeys faster, and I grant you, with some journeys also slower. It may be helpful if I explain the reasons behind this change. Since the end of industrial action, to which he referred in his remarks, the main cause of disruption on the southern network has been trains and train staff travelling on different lines during the day. This has meant that the disruption, when it has occurred, has often spread rapidly across the network, because if a driver or train is caught up in disruption on one route, this can impact very quickly their availability for the route on which they are next meant to be working. The new timetable keeps trains and train staff working on the same route throughout the day, containing any disruption to that specific route. In addition, work has been done so that the timing of services does not conflict with other services on the network. This work has included separating Gatwick Express and Southern services on the Brighton Main Line. So the net result is that Hassocks now receives a consistent 4 Gatwick Express trains per hour on the route from Brighton to Victoria during the peak, and 2 Southern trains per hour from Littlehampton during the off-peak. Previously, Hassocks was served by a combination, as he knows, of Southern and Gatwick Express services coming from Brighton or Littlehampton at all times. I do appreciate his point that this is nonetheless still a considerable number of passengers, but they are now, I believe, in a position where they are able to choose between Southern and Gatwick Express services. Passengers from Hassocks will benefit from the performance benefits which will come in time from fully separating Gatwick Express and Southern services. I also want to emphasise that the vast majority of passengers travelling to London from Hassocks are being well served by this timetable change. I recognise that 9.45 or somewhere under 10% of weekday journeys nonetheless is a significant number of his constituents who use services from Hassocks. However, it is also worth remembering that over 90% of passengers using Hassocks are going to Victoria or on Thameslink services. Overall, connections from Hassocks into London are much improved. Hassocks now receives 12 direct services to Victoria in the morning peak, compared to 7 before the timetable change. This provides a significant capacity increase for those passengers going to Victoria. As this is a Gatwick Express route during the peaks, it is run with new trains, with air conditioning, Wi-Fi and power sockets. On average, the journey from Hassocks to Victoria in the morning used to take over an hour. Now the journey takes, on average, 51 minutes, so significantly better than it took in 1905 when he produced the timetable.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Before he receives the fate of politicians and other public figures in Sussex who have particularly infuriated us and is burnt in effigy, could I ask him to reconsider his comment when he says that services are much improved? I think what he meant is they might be much improved when the new timetable is finally introduced and works properly. But he cannot say, and nobody can say, that the current level of service is much improved.
Indeed, I prefaced all of my comments by saying once we're over this hump, the current difficulties. So I'm saying once the timetable is fully bedded in and working to the levels it should, and of course he's right, and I repeat what I said earlier, there has been improvement, as I hope he acknowledges, but there is significant room for further improvement so that services are of the standard which his constituents and those of my friend, the Honourable Member for Horsham, have a right to expect. So on average, the journey times will be down by 10 minutes in the morning into Victoria from Hassocks when the service is operating at the levels it should be. Yeah.
I do appreciate that there is an inquiry ongoing, but I wonder if my honourable friend is able to confirm whether this is attributable purely to the retraining of the drivers, and when that retraining is concluded, the timetable will be operating properly, or the new timetable, or are there other issues that need to be got to grips with as well? I appreciate there's an inquiry ongoing, but any light that he can throw on that, I would be most grateful.
Thank you, Mr. Betts. Yes, the sheer magnitude of the timetable change affecting GTR, one of the biggest changes that the railway industry has ever seen, and the late delivery of the timetable as a consequence, meant that GTR was substantially behind where it should have been on driver training and getting in place all the appropriate train diagrams. That driver training and reorganisation work, which should have been ready in time for May the 20th, is now being done at pace. And once that has worked its way through, we anticipate being able progressively to move back to the full May timetable. Mr. Betts, there are the same number of services going from Hassocks to London Bridge as before the timetable change. For a temporary period, I grant you, Hassocks receives fewer peak services to Blackfriars compared to before the timetable change, but this is a temporary result of the rephasing of the timetable, and this route will receive an extra service each hour from December this year. Average journey times to Blackfriars and London Bridge are now between 5 and 10 minutes shorter than previously, providing passengers with quicker direct access to London Bridge, Blackfriars, the City, Farringdon and St Pancras. The new Thameslink service also offers passengers different options for getting to their final station. For example, people who interchange at Clapham Junction for Waterloo presently will instead be able to interchange at London Bridge for Waterloo East. The opening of the Elizabeth line through Farringdon in December will offer further journey opportunities. My right honourable friend mentioned compensation. Passengers are encouraged, as ever, to apply to their train operator for delay repay compensation for affected journeys. We are seeing increased take-up of that compensation as awareness of it and as the ease with which people can access it grows. We've also announced a special compensation scheme for GTR passengers. It is to be funded by the rail industry and will ensure regular rail customers receive appropriate redress for the disruption they have experienced. I encourage passengers to apply to GTR for delay repay compensation. GTR operates this scheme for all its passengers, and under it, passengers can claim compensation for each delay of more than 15 minutes, whatever the cause of the delay. Mr. Betts, I want to conclude by thanking my right honourable friend for bringing this subject to Westminster Hall. It's an important subject, and it is absolutely right that his constituents get the services they deserve as rapidly as possible. I want to remind the House that the vast majority of passengers will, in time, once it's bedded in, end up being well served by this timetable change. For those travelling to Victoria, they'll have an extra 5 additional services during the morning peak. For those travelling on Thameslink, journey times will be between 5 and 10 minutes quicker. In time, Mr. Betts, I hope my right honourable friend will agree that rail services into Hassocks will be much improved once they are fully bedded in.
Order, order. The sitting is suspended until 2:30 p.m.